Nobody had cracked the door of the old cider house in 38 years. It leaned at the upper end of a hill orchard on the backside of Hawkbill Knob in the Arkansas Ozarks, a half-collapsed cellar of mortared fieldstone dug back into the slope the way the old settlers built them so the cold of the earth would keep the apples and the pressed cider sweet through a hard winter. A great wild grapevine, thick as a man's wrist and older than anyone living, had crawled across the front of it over the decades until the heavy plank door was sewn shut behind a green curtain of leaf and tendril, and you could walk the orchard row in summer and never know there was a door there at all. The people of Hawkbill had quit seeing the cider house the way you quit seeing a barn that has stood since before you were born. The county had it on the rolls as a derelict structure on tax-delinquent ground. The man who leased the lower pasture for his cattle had it figured as a snake den, and he said more than once, leaning on the gate in the cool of the evening, that the sensible thing would be to push the whole hillside in on top of it with a dozer and be done. Everyone agreed the cider house was caved in and grown over and finished, nothing but old dark and old air. Until, on a still gold morning in the last warm week of October, an arthritic old treeing walker coon-hound named Bishop rose off the porch he could barely climb anymore, crossed an orchard he had no business crossing on those stiff hips, and lay down with his white and black chest pressed flat against that vine-sown door, and would not be moved. The woman who watched him do it was named Odessa Sharp, and she was 68 years old, and she had until the 1st of December, before the only ground she had ever called her own went under the auctioneer's hammer at the county seat. She had not planned to keep the dog. Bishop had belonged to her late husband Carl, who had run a small pack of coon-hounds up and down those hollows for the better part of 40 years. Carl had passed in the spring, sudden, out in the dog lot, with a feed bucket still in his hand, and he had left Odessa a hill farm with a leaking roof, a stack of doctor's bills, a property tax debt that had been quietly growing for 3 years while they pretended it wasn't, and one old hound gone gray in the face and so stiff with arthritis that some mornings he could not get his back legs under him without help. The notices had come gentle at first, all through the summer. Then the hard one came in September, with a date printed on it, and the date was the 1st of December, and after that the cabin and the 40 acres of ridge and hollow and old hill orchard that Carl's grandfather had cleared with an axe and a mule would belong to whoever lifted a hand highest on the courthouse steps. Odessa had read that notice standing at the rusted mailbox, and she had folded it down small and slid it into the pocket of her barn coat, and she had not breathed a word of it to a single living soul, because there was no one left up on Hawkbill to tell. She had come to that farm as a young bride and never once left it, and her people and Carl's were all scattered or in the grave now, until it was only Carl and Odessa and the dogs on the whole of that ridge. They had never been people of money. The orchard had stopped paying when the old apple varieties fell out of fashion, and after that the farm fed them and not much more. The 40 acres were the whole of the kingdom she had ever wanted, and now a single sheet of paper was going to take them, and she lay awake in the long autumn nights doing the arithmetic over and over, and every single time the figures came out the same. There was no money. There had never been any money. There was only the land and the cabin and an old crippled-up dog and 6 weeks. So when the old hound first began leaving the porch, Odessa thought he was only grieving the way she was grieving looking for a man who was not going to come back across the dog lot ever again. The first morning she found him at the top of the orchard, she could hardly believe his stiff old legs had carried him that far, and she half carried him home, with his front feet walking and her arms taking the weight of his hind quarters, his short white coat damp with dew. The second morning he was gone before she woke, and she found him in the very same spot, lying against the vine-laced door with his whole body shaking, not from the morning chill, but from the strain of pressing himself against the wood. The third morning she quit trying to bring him back and simply followed him up the rows. An arthritic old dog should not have walked that far for anything, and that was the part Odessa could not make sense of, standing winded in the wet orchard grass watching him. The cider house was 200 yards up the slope, past the gnarled old apple trees gone half wild, and through a thicket of sumac and blackberry cane, and the door was so curtained in grapevine that you had to part the leaves with both hands to even find the planks. But Bishop went to it straight as a plumb line every morning, the way a dog goes to a thing he can smell far better than he can see, and he laid his white chest against the vine-sown wood and pressed and let out a long, low, broken bawl. Not the ringing bugle of a hound on a hot track, but something older and lonelier, a sound that rolled down the hollow and stood the hair up on Odessa's arms. He pawed at the bottom seam, where the planks met the worn stone sill, with old feet gone tender from years of lying on a porch, until they cracked and bled, and still he pawed. And no matter how she coaxed him, no matter how she got both hands in his collar and pulled, the old hound would not come away. People on the ridge took notice, the way ridge people always do. A man named Del Surratt, who ran his cattle on the leased pasture below and had bought 2 or 3 of Carl's pups over the years, drove up the orchard track one morning to see what all the bawling was about. And he stood in the grass with his thumbs hooked in the bib of his overalls and watched the old hound throw his weight against the green curtain of vine. And he shook his head slow. "Odessa," he said, not unkind, "that dog's gone simple. It takes 'em that way sometimes, when they get old and lose their man in the one season. He don't know where he is or what he's after. Kindest thing you could do is pen him up at the house before he hurts hisself worse." "He knows exactly where he is," Odessa said. She could not have told anyone why she said it. She only knew, watching the dog, that it was true down to the bone. Del looked at her a long beat. Then he looked past her at the vine-sown door of the cider house, and something flickered across his face. Quick, there, and gone. "That old cider house," he said slower now. "Carl ever get that thing open all the years you been up here?" "Nobody's had it open since before Carl's daddy passed," Odessa said. "Carl always said his grandpa shut it up the autumn the orchard quit paying and never went back. Said there wasn't a thing in there but rotted barrels and copperheads and a roof fixin' to come down." Del nodded, a touch too quick, and tugged his cap down. "Well," he said, "I'd leave her shut, was I you. Them old dug-in cellars, the hill works at 'em, and the back wall lets go all at once. Body could go in after that fool dog and have the mountain land on top of him." And he climbed back in his truck and went down the track a good deal faster than he had come up it. And Odessa stood watching the dust settle, and thought, for the first time, that Del Surratt had not driven up the hill to talk to her about the dog at all. She sat up most of that night in Carl's old chair by the wood stove, with the stiff old hound stretched out, groaning in his sleep at her feet, and she turned Del Surratt's face over and over in her mind, That quick flicker when he looked at the cider house, and then the too fast warning about the back wall caving in. She had known Dell 40 years. He was not a mean man, but he was a Surratt. And the Surratts had wanted that ridge as long as anybody could remember, had leased the bottom and bought the timber rights, and circled back to the upper acres again and again across the decades. She remembered, faint as an old smell, her father-in-law saying the Surratt name at the supper table with a hardness she had not understood as a young wife. Something about the year the orchard went under, and who had held the paper on it. There was history buried in that hillside, she thought, history Carl's people had never told her. And an old crippled hound had walked straight up 200 yards of ridge to lie down at the place where it lay buried. She did not sleep much that night. But for the first time since the notice came, she did not feel only the cold, sick weight of the loss pressing her down into the chair. She felt something else underneath it, small and stubborn. It felt very much like hope. A hard frost came in the night, the first true one of the year, and in the gold of the next morning the orchard was furred white, and the only marks across it were the dragging, stumbling line of an old dog's tracks going up the slope. Odessa found Bishop at the door again, frost on his short white back, his cracked paws scrabbling at the bottom of the vine-sown planks. And when she knelt to gather him up, he turned his cloudy old eyes toward her and bawled once, low and broken, straight into her chest, and she understood all at once that he was not going to stop. He was going to lie against that door until the cold or the strain killed him. And she found that she could not let her dead husband's old hound die alone in the frost at a sealed door for the sake of a thing she was too tired and too beaten down to look at for herself. So Odessa Sharp walked back down to the barn, and she took down Carl's heavy splitting maul and the long iron wrecking bar that had hung on the wall since before he died, and she fetched the brush hook off its nail besides, and she climbed back up the slope in the thin frost morning sun, and she set to opening the old cider house. It took her the best part of 3 days. First she had to fight the grapevine, a green rope grown into the very stone, and she hacked at it with the brush hook, a strand at a time, until her shoulders burned and her hands blistered through her work gloves, peeling the curtain back off the planks the way you'd peel a stubborn hide. Under the vine, the door was hung in a frame of mortared fieldstone, and the heavy oak planks had swelled and rotted and frozen and swelled again across 38 years until they were wedged solid as the rock around them. And the great iron strap hinges Carl's grandfather had forged were rusted into one welded lump. She was an old woman with a bad shoulder and a maul too heavy for her, and the first whole hour she got nowhere at all. She had to think it through the way Carl would have, slow and from the ground up. She cleared the rotted leaf mold and the matted vine roots away from the top of the frame with a mattock until she found the seam where the planks met the lintel stone. Then she set the long wrecking bar into the gap and laid her whole weight against it and held it there, and rested, and laid her weight against it again, the way you work a fence post that does not want to come, not with a strength she did not have, but with a patience she did. The wood groaned against her, and splinters and rotten pegs broke loose and fell. The old hound lay back in the cured grass and watched her with the terrible total trust of an animal that has decided a thing is going to come out all right, no longer pawing, no longer bawling, only watching, as if he had handed the work over to her. Twice she sat down hard in the cold grass and cried, from the ache deep in her shoulder and the bone-certain knowledge that she was an old fool breaking into a buried cellar on a piece of ground that would not be hers in 6 weeks' time. Both times the old hound dragged himself up onto his stiff legs and pushed his cold nose against her wet cheek, and both times she wiped her face on her sleeve and got back up and took hold of the bar again. On the third afternoon the door gave all at once. The frame of stone held fast, but the swollen oak planks tore loose of the welded hinges with a screech that seemed to come up out of the hill itself, and the whole door swung and fell inward into the dark, and a long breath of air came rolling out of the black, cool and bone-dry, and smelling not of rot and copperheads as Dell had promised, but of dry cedar and old apples and beeswax. The clean, still smell of a room sealed up tight before anything in it could ever spoil. Bishop was on his feet before she could stop him. Stiff as he was through the broken doorway and down the worn stone steps into the black before she could close a hand on his collar, and she heard him reach the bottom and let out that long broken ball one more time, and then go silent. Odessa lit the lantern she had carried up from the barn, and she followed her dead husband's dog down into the dark. The cider house was not caved in. That was the first of Del Surratt's lies that the lantern light undid. The back wall, dug into the cold heart of the hill, stood straight and dry and true. The low ceiling held on its hewn cedar beams without a sag, and the air, though close and still, was clean and dry. Not a drop of seep anywhere on the stone. Whatever Carl's grandfather had sealed into that hillside 38 years before, he had sealed it well, against the damp and the vermin and the eyes of every man who ever leaned on a gate and called it a snake den, fit only for a dozer. Odessa stood at the foot of the steps and lifted the lantern high, and the light spread slow across the room, and she forgot to breathe. The cider house was full, not full of rot, and not full of fallen-in hill, full of the things a man hides away when he means to keep them safe and never gets the chance to come back. Along the dry stone shelves, where the apple barrels and the crocks of cider once stood there, sat row upon row of stoneware jugs and lidded jars, sealed over with wax and waxed cloth, heavy with something that did not slosh when she set the lantern down. Against the dry back wall stood a tall jelly cupboard of punched tin and aged walnut, its doors latched shut, and beside it a hump-backed steamer trunk strapped in leather, gone stiff and black as iron. And in the very center of the dry stone floor, where the old hound had now lain down at last, finally and completely still, his gray face turned up toward her as if to say there, "That is the thing I have been trying so hard to tell you," sat a man's wide-brimmed felt hat, set down crown first on the stone, and tucked inside the crown of it a worn leather pouch, and laid across an upturned cider barrel. Beside it a folded canvas duster coat that Odessa knew. It had been Carl's grandfather's. She had seen it 1,000 times in the brown old photograph that hung on the cabin wall. A young, hard-jawed man standing in that very coat in front of the orchard's first full press the autumn it opened. She knelt on the cold stone and opened the leather pouch first, and inside it, wrapped in waxed paper, soft with age, were papers. Deeds. A surveyor's plat of the 40 acres, drawn out in a careful, slanting hand, and a letter, written in pencil by a hand that shook, dated the autumn the orchard went under, 38 years gone. She read it, kneeling there on the cold stone floor with the old hound's flank rising and falling slow against her knee. It was from Carl's grandfather, and it told a story the whole ridge had buried right along with the cider house. The orchard had not simply failed on its own. In its last bad year, a man named Surratt, who would have been Dell's grandfather, had held the note on the place, the very same as the county now held Odessa's, and he had meant to take the whole 40 for the white oak and walnut timber on the back ridge, which was worth 10 times over the failing orchard below it. And Carl's grandfather, knowing he could not save the orchard, had done the one thing a cornered man could still do. He had sold off the last good apple crop, and the great press's brass fittings, and the gold double eagles his own father had carried up out of the bottoms in a coffee can, quietly, all through one hard winter, and rather than hand the money across to the Surratts to be swallowed up against a debt that was going to take the land regardless, he had carried it up the hill and sealed it into the dry, cold cider house where the stone never wept, and pegged the door, and grown the grapevine across it on purpose, and written the whole of it down in pencil, so that one day a sharp who truly needed it would find it and clear the note and hold the land in the family's name. He had meant to come back in the spring and set it all right himself. But he had died that same winter of a pleurisy, the letter unread, the door sewn shut, the secret gone down into the ground with him. And the orchard had gone to default after all, and not one living soul had known that the whole price of saving the place had lain dry and whole in the dark of the hill the entire time. The letter ended with a line that made Odessa press her flat hand against the old hound's side. "If you are reading this," the letter said, "then you have come up into the dark on the word of something that loved this hill more than it ever feared it. Trust it all the way. There is enough here to keep what is ours. Don't let the Surratts tell you it's a caved-in snake hole." The old man had signed his name, and below the name he had written one more line, and the pencil had near worn clean through the soft paper. "My old hound pony lies at the door. He found it before ever I did." Odessa sat very still on the cold stone. Pony, a white and black Walker hound, 38 years dead, who had lain at the cider house door the very way Bishop lay at it now, who had smelled through 38 years of stone and grown over vine the one thing his master had hidden away, and who had tried, in the only way a dog has, to tell. And when the old man died that winter, the dog had kept the secret along with him, the way these hounds keep everything they are given, and the blood of him had run down through the long line Carl had bred and loved, hound out of hound, across the decades, down at the last to an arthritic old dog who had never once set foot near that door, and who had risen off a porch one October morning on his ruined hips and walked straight up to it, because somewhere in the deep marrow of him the knowing of it had been handed down, generation to generation, plain as the ticking in the coat. She pried open the strapped steamer trunk last of all, kneeling there in the warm lantern light. The leather straps had gone to powder and parted at the first touch of the iron. Inside, packed in dry cedar shavings and as bright as the day they had been laid down, were the coins, gold double eagles and half eagles and silver dollars, sorted into canvas pokes, and beneath all of it the honest worth of a whole season's crop and a full cider, works in hard old money, hidden away by a dying man for a grandson's wife he would never live to meet. The stoneware jugs along the shelves held still more, rolled banknotes and old gold certificates sealed up in beeswax against the damp. Things a dealer down in Fayetteville would later tell Odessa were worth a very great deal more for what they were than for the gold in them. Enough. More than enough. Enough to clear the note 3 times over and put a new roof on the cabin and never have to read another courthouse notice at the mailbox as long as she lived. Odessa did not shout or cry out or run pell-mell down the hill. She sat down on the cold stone floor with Carl's grandfather's old canvas duster across her lap, and the arthritic old hound's heavy head settled into the crook of her arm, and she stroked his soft, ticked ears for a long while and said nothing at all. Then she leaned down close to that cloudy old face, and even knowing how little he could hear, she said it anyway. "Good dog. Good old dog, Bishop. You good old dog, you." And the hound's long tail thumped once, slow and heavy, against the dry stone, and he let out a long breath that was almost a sigh, the sound of a creature that has carried a weight a very long way and has finally set it down. She did not do it all at once, nor carelessly. The next morning she drove Carl's old truck down off the ridge to Fayetteville with a single canvas poke of the gold double eagles wrapped in a feed sack on the seat beside her, and she walked into the storefront office of a coin dealer named Halloran, whose name she had heard Carl speak once or twice, and set the poke down on the glass counter and asked the man, plain as she knew how, whether what was in it was worth anything. The man loosened the drawstring and looked and went very quiet. He took up one of the gold pieces in a pair of soft cotton gloves and turned it slow under his bright lamp, and then he looked up at Odessa Sharp, standing there in her dead husband's barn coat, and he asked her, very careful, whether there was any more of it. She told him there was a good deal more. He sat down on his stool. He told her, in the slow measuring way of a man who has learned never to look too eager, that the early dates and the mint marks made these particular pieces worth far more than the gold weight in them, that there were collectors who would pay, and pay hard, for old coins that had gone down into the dark in one century and come up untouched in the next, and that she was under no circumstances to spend them flat at a bank or sell them to the first quick man who came smiling around with an offer. He wrote out for her the name of an honest auction house down in Little Rock, and gave her his own card besides, and he watched her drive away with the look of a man who had just laid eyes on something he would be telling his grandchildren about. Then she drove to the county courthouse, and she paid the back taxes in full at the clerk's window, every last penny and every penalty besides. And she carried the pencil letter and the old deeds into the small office of a young lawyer who took one long look at the dates and the seals and told her, gentle and a little amazed, that 38 years was a long time to wait, but that a recorded deed and a paid note do not care in the least how long they have had to sit. He set the wheels of it turning that very afternoon, and when at last it was done, when the note was cleared and the lien lifted and the auction struck from the courthouse calendar and the 40 acres stood free and clear in the name of Sharp, the way Carl's grandfather had meant for it to stand, the young lawyer walked her to the door and shook her hand and told her he had practiced law in that county 11 years and never once seen an auction called off 6 weeks before the gavel was meant to fall, and certainly never once on account of a dog. Del Surratt came up the orchard track 3 days after that, once the word had gone around Hawkbill that Odessa Sharp had broken open the old cider house with her own 2 hands and had been seen driving Carl's truck down to the courthouse twice in 1 week. He came up fast, with his cap held in his hands and his face the color of cold tallow, and he found Odessa sitting on the cabin porch with the old hound asleep in the sun at her feet and a lawyer's thick envelope resting on the rail beside her. "Odessa," he started in, "whatever it is you found up in that old hole, you want to step careful now. There's old debts on this ground. There's things Carl's people never told you about. My family's got a claim on this place goes way back, and I know exactly what your family's got a claim to," Odessa said, and she said it soft and even, which was a great deal worse than if she had risen up and shouted at him. She reached over and took up the lawyer's envelope and held it out across the porch rail, and inside it was a clean copy of a pencil letter 38 years old and a recorded deed and a paid-in-full receipt from the county for every cent of the back taxes, and the note besides. "I paid it all off this week. The land's free and clear and in my name now, and it'll stay in this family's name a long while after you and me are both under the ground. Your grandpa never got it. Carl's grandpa made good and sure of that the same winter he died up here. And his old hound is what showed me where." She looked down at Bishop, asleep and twitching in the sun at some good old dream. "And his old hound kept the whole secret the entire time you and yours were calling this place a caved-in snake hole." Del Surratt stood in the yard a long moment with his cap in his hands. Then he set it back on his head and turned and went back down the orchard track and did not come up Hawkbill again. The arthritic old tree-and-walker coon hound named Bishop lived on better than another full year, which is a long good while for a stiff old dog, and he spent it on a porch with a new roof overhead, on a piece of ground no courthouse notice would ever take away. And every so often on a still gold morning he would heave himself up off the boards and walk slow and sure up through the orchard and lie down a while against the open cider house door in the dry, clean air, his white chest pressed to the cool stone, feeling for something only he could feel. And Odessa Sharp, who had been 6 weeks from losing every last thing she had in this world, would walk up the rows after him and lower herself down into the grass at his side and rest her hand on his old white back. And the two of them would stay there a good long while in the quiet, the old woman and the old hound, at the door of the dark that had handed them back their whole world. If you have ever loved an old dog like that one, then you already know how the rest of it goes, and you could do a good deal worse than to follow along here with these quiet stories. People up on Hawkbill still talk about it. They say a crippled-up old dog can't walk 200 yards of frosted hill on ruined hips for a thing he can't even hear behind a foot of stone and a curtain of grapevine. They say a hound can't carry a secret 38 years and hand it down a line of pups to a dog that was never once there to learn it. They say it isn't possible. And then they go quiet, the way Del Surratt went quiet, and they look up the hollow toward the old cider house with its broken open door, and they don't say another word. Because some things a good old dog knows that a man never will. Some loyalties run deeper than hearing and older than memory and a great deal longer than any single life. And sometimes the only thing standing between an old woman and the loss of everything she loves is a stiff old hound who will drag himself up a frozen hill and lie down at a sealed door and bawl into the dark and refuse, for the love of a man near 40 years gone, to be moved.